Okay, it's 2 p.m. on Saturday, Eastern Standard Time here in Atlanta, Georgia. And this is Stephen Ramsden. I'm here with This Week in Birding and Nature Photography on Sunlit Earth. And I'm happy you guys can join us. We've got a great show this week. As always, we've really been able to get some quality guests on this show. And I'm not sure what it is, but it's probably my good looks and welcoming demeanor. That's what I'm guessing. But anyway, we've had some really wonderful shows so far. We took a break last week because of the holiday here in the United States, and this week we're starting up again with my great friend Steve Rushing, who is a well-known local nature photographer and conservationist type volunteer extraordinaire. Everyone loves Steve Rushing. I don't know anyone who doesn't. Um, uh, and we are going to talk about photography and settings on the camera today. We may have some guests join in. Not sure yet. It was a little bit of an impromptu start for me. But first, Steve, how are you doing, man? How do you feel?
I feel great. I feel safe. I just stayed in my bubble.
Staying in the bubble. I got you, man.
In the bubble.
You have a lovely library behind you. I don't think I've seen this view before. You're usually out on your patio joining
Yeah,
us on our meetings.
a lot of leaf blowers out today. So
Yeah. Some cool. I always like to study what people have in their houses on these things. I think it's always very interesting. And I see a picture of maybe your son and his wife or girlfriend, and I see a bass or some sort of fish and lots of good books up on your bookcase. A very reputable and legit background you have there. Now, is that your real background, or is that some sort of photograph you're using as a background?
that's the real thing. And by the way, that's a picture of me and my wife Ann
Oh, okay.
at Machu Picchu.
Machu Picchu. I have been there. It's a beautiful place. I highly recommend it for anyone. Okay. Well, you look so healthy and young all the time. I couldn't tell a difference between you and Clark or Byron or Brian. Is it Byron or Brian?
Byron.
Byron and Clark are your two sons. Do you have any other children?
Yeah, if you look over that shoulder, the
Uh,
black and white picture is my daughter Elizabeth on her wedding
Elizabeth.
day, where she and I got first looks. So
Awesome. So there's three kids then.
three kids,
Three kids. And how long have you been married?
43 years.
43 years of marriage. Boy, you think you're going to stick with it? Or,
I'm too far. I'm too far in now. Plus, she runs all of the finances. She's a
oh,
CPA,
yeah,
so
I
I'd
hear you,
go.
man.
I'd go broke in a heartbeat if I tried to run.
Hey, I'm right there with you. Yeah, I've only been married what for 12 years. But I'm terrified of my wife because she's an attorney, and I always tell her if you leave, I'm going with you because I'm scared to death of what you might do to me. So we're gonna stay married. But we met at the Clyde Shepherd Nature Preserve several years ago, and it's been a really good thing to be your friend, and I'm really glad that you accepted the invitation to come talk about what you do, man.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate the
So
invitation.
very good. Can you turn up your volume at all, or maybe you're a little bit low?
Well, I'm soft spoken too, so let
Yeah.
me.
Well, you're gonna have to cut that out for today. You're
Okay,
gonna have to.
I'll have to. I'll have to yell.
Ah, so before we start up with your photography information, and we're just gonna have an informal chat back and forth about mostly about Steve and how he does his photography because he's been doing it a lot longer than I have and a lot longer than most of us have, and I'm hoping to learn some good things from him. But it's always an interactive thing here on our broadcast, and we welcome questions. If you'd like to join in, um, I am posting the link now on the Facebook page, Sunlit Earth. In fact, I have two people asking me, "Where's the link? Where's the link?" Well, it's the same link we use every week, but I'll post it again. So bear with me, Steve. I know I'm doing all the
Okay,
talking.
no problem.
It'll just be a second. There we go. Copy. Let's see. Invite. Copy. Invite link. It's always something. Okay. Just a moment. Yeah, Alexander Hart from the UK is asking me where the link is, and that's me talking in the background. I'll turn that off in just a moment.
I'll tell you, when Alexandra is on, it's intimidating. She knows her stuff.
Yeah, she is pretty awesome. I'm lucky to have her as a friend too. I don't know how I get this great group of friends, but um, so here locally, we like to start the show with what's going on locally, and I just well, we had another break-in at the nature preserve. So that's a total of 2 in the last month with camera gear being stolen. But we also got approval for 6 security cameras, a slew of new signs at the preserve. Okay, there's 2 people wanting to get in. Admit. And I've put up the signs, and we're gonna, as soon as the cameras get in, we're gonna put those up as well. And the DeKalb County Police have been extraordinarily cooperative, helping us out and telling us the things we should do. So I went out yesterday and cut about 2 dozen low branches around the front of the preserve, because the police told me that better visibility is a must from the street, so that when they cruise by, when the people take off, they can see where they go. So I cut a bunch of low branches at the preserve. Welcome, Alexandra and Buddy. Glad to have you. Steve Rushing is with us. And we're just talking about the local scene now. And so whenever the cameras come in next week, I'm going to get Buddy Harold to come out and get up on the 40-foot ladder and put him on the tree for us. And maybe Alexandra can fly in and stay for a couple of days to test out the cameras with us, since she's such a great photographer. But that should add some security to the preserve. But again, those of us that go there and take photos, and any nature preserve you go to, it's an easy target for criminals. And just a few precautions. I was dumb to have everything within reach of the windows. I wasn't really thinking all that well, but I have taken steps to make sure that doesn't happen again. And while I was cutting down the low branches yesterday, I counted 31 pine siskins on the bird bath at the nature preserve, and 11 bluebirds. So we went through, and there's just a slew of songbirds everywhere out there. It's very, very crowded songbirds at the feeders. Finches, siskins, and your assorted, standard local birds. And we had what we call an 8-point buck, Alexander. That means a deer that has 8 tips on its antlers. They count the number of tips on the antlers, and that's called points here for hunters in the South. And so we had an 8-point buck that was hit by a car and wandered into the nature preserve and died by the amphibian pond. And, it was a horrible thing, of course, but this is the season where they get very aggressive and go mating. It's called the rut. And this deer was a victim of that. And he was about half buried in the mud. And so Jeff Irick, my other friend on the board, wanted to harvest the antlers off of the deer to use for some educational purposes. So he told me how to do it. And I went in and used a hacksaw and cut the antlers off the deer's head. And it was a horrible experience that I don't recommend for anyone. But we do have the antlers, and that's the exciting things at the nature preserve for now. And today, Alexander, you'll be excited about this. We did a workshop with several young people at another local park where we made solar pinhole cameras. And we made about 30 pinhole cameras, which, I did it with adults last year, and it was really difficult to get the adults to pay attention to what I was saying, because everybody kept making funny jokes, and nobody was really all that interested in what we were doing. These kids really knocked it out. I mean, they were interested, and I had some pictures of what it was going to look like when the exposure got done and all that. And I do have some of that stuff left. So, Buddy, I was going to actually call you and see if you wanted to get together and make a couple with your granddaughter so that you guys can mount them. But we'll see, because I got a lot of materials left for that. So Steve Rushing, by the way, y'all are both still muted if you didn't know. Steve Rushing, what kind of birds have you had over at the Rushing Outdoors headquarters this week?
Well, it's the kind of the winter usual cast of characters. Things have kind of settled into the winter patterns. I've had kinglets, bluebirds, yellow rumps, coming and going. Chickadees, Carolina chickadees are here quite frequently. I get my fair share of pine siskins. The one thing that's changed a little bit, the big flocks of blackbirds have started coming in, and redwings and so forth, but there's been a couple of rusties
Mm,
in
mhm.
the flock, and they're very severely threatened. And so it's been nice to see them come in.
Outstanding. The rusty blackbird is unusual for us. And I think it's got a different color eye. Is that right? Is that how you tell them?
I just look at their rusty back. They don't have this starkly, like the grackles and they have that starkly bright eyes, but the
Right.
rusties aren't quite that.
Yeah, and you usually see them mixed in with the other blackbirds, right?
Right.
Yeah,
And they're definitely in the minority. I mean,
yeah,
I felt very fortunate to see some. Now, the flock at Decatur Cemetery every year usually has 7 or 8 that will be in that flock.
yeah. And we usually get 1 or 2 at Clyde Shepherd every year, also. But definitely, Decatur Cemetery has got a huge flock of them over there that are fun to watch. Uh, Buddy, have you had any remarkable sightings this week in your birding? I know that you went up to the Chattahoochee Riverwalk and checked it out. You're still muted, by the way. You're still muted.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun up at the Chattahoochee this week. There were tons and tons of cedar waxwings up there, which
Yeah.
were very entertaining.
Yeah.
And then there was some a lot of shorebirds along the river. There were killdeer and
Right. Plovers.
some Wilson snipes,
Yeah.
and so there was that. And then the usual, I saw a couple of gold crown
Mhm.
kinglets,
Mhm.
and a lot of different kinds of woodpeckers. So it
Mhm.
was pretty busy up there.
Yeah, I love that place. Last time I tried to go up there, it was under about 4 feet of water, the road, so I couldn't get there. But I remember last year that there's this little island that you could see, and there was just hundreds of cedar waxwings on these bushes on this little island out there,
Yeah.
and it was really incredible. And you could get eye level shots of them also. Did you experience that this time, or were they high up in the trees?
They were actually in the bushes right next to me. Out there's a couple of little places. If you go out on the boardwalk, there's
Right.
there are a couple of little side areas off of the boardwalk where you can sit or whatever. And so I was there, and then a flock of them just landed in the bushes right in front of me.
Yeah,
So
that's awesome.
they were about 10 feet away from me, so they were very entertaining.
Did you tell them to go home because they were drunk, or no?
They were having a good time.
Yeah, I like that place. The only thing I don't like about that place is that if you use a tripod, that boardwalk just bounces constantly. When somebody's gonna be walking up 100 feet away and the boardwalk just bounces up and down the whole time.
Yeah, I usually just carry a monopod whenever I go out there, and it's a little, it doesn't get in the way of people walking on the boardwalk and that kind of thing. So
Yeah, well, my main camera is still this, and so I don't have to use my tripod. But we're waiting. Alexandra, you look like you just got off a BBC interview for some earth-shattering thing that you've done. You always are so professional and look so well put together. I don't know what it is. Is the hubby with you today?
No, he's disappeared somewhere, but we've just been out for a walk around town, so we've just come back.
Oh.
1 minute to go, and I couldn't find the Zoom meet.
Yeah, it's always the same Zoom link every week, but I was a little bit late because I had gotten back late from the students' workshop that I was doing. So I understand you may have seen a barn owl this week.
Yes, I think so, yeah. Considering my number of owl experiences is probably I can count on one hand.
Right.
It's quite, an exceptional thing for me.
Tell us about it.
Yeah, it was, I was just sort of like driving to work just over like the railway bridge. And then it just flew across in front of me. So I slowed down and I watched him just sort of like glide, along the fields.
Right.
Right. It was sort of like, it was still dark, but it was just sort of like getting a little bit semi-light.
Mm-hmm.
It was very, very pale. So I presume it's
Yeah, your barn owls there are whiter than ours. Ours are more of a gold color
really?
here, but they're the same shape, obviously, but they're a little bit more gold. And yours are really pale white over there because there's a guy, Craig, somebody who's constantly posting owl photos from the UK, and you know, it's a great thing to sight a barn owl. I've only seen, well, I've seen a bunch of them in nests, but I've only seen one actually flying around, and that was down at Lake Apopka in Orlando, where we would have went had you came. And that was the greatest bird photo I've ever taken, and I doubt I'll ever take a better bird photo. But it was looking right at me as it flew by, you know, and just had that face, you know, like it was waving almost, and then it went and slaughtered a mouse and took it back. It was just an incredible thing.
But yeah, it's just the way how they just slowly sort of like float along, just sort of like glide, like a very faint, like ghostly.
Yeah. In fact, I read all the time that they are responsible for a lot of ghost stories in the old U.S. at least, because they're so pale and they look like flying ghosts at night, and they make this just crazy screeching sound that sounds like someone's being murdered. So I mean, it really does. It's a crazy screeching sound that they make. So yeah, you're really fortunate for that. And this is just,
that's my excitement of the week.
Well, this is a great reason for you to go buy a constantly on camera for the front of your vehicle that just takes photographs constantly, just in case you see another one.
Yeah, that would have caught it actually.
Yeah, see, so you got to quit messing around and just, you know, mount a permanent 24-hour 4K camera to your hood and your rear, just in case it's behind you. And then you can,
that's a good idea.
Because, you know, we're all like excessive about our hobby, and all of us have, you know, way more camera gear than we'll ever use. So come on and get with us. Okay. Steve, what were you thinking about today for your talk? I know we advertised we're going to talk about some camera settings that you use, and maybe you'll share some photographs with us. Do you feel like doing that today?
I've got it all ready.
You do. I'm going to put us in speaker mode, and welcome Steve Rushing, a local photographer who's going to hopefully share some of his skill with us, because I need some.
Now, is that being shared, Stephen?
Yes, it is. It looks perfect. Thank you.
Great. Well, that's actually a very intimidating opening, given who's on this Zoom call. And I want to start out with some disclaimers, right? One is, these are just my thoughts. I won't pretend that they're better than anyone else's thoughts. They're just mine, but they are some things that I have learned over time, both being an outdoors person almost my entire life, as well as taking pictures for some 40 plus years of that life. I also want to make sure that everyone understands that I shoot Olympus, and I won't make this an advertisement for Olympus, although I will plug it every once in a while, some of the things it does that I really like about it. But for that reason, it's a 2x crop camera. So my exact settings don't transfer very well to you Nikon and Canon shooters, particularly if you're shooting full format. So rather than just talk specifically about the settings, I want to talk about why I chose to take the settings I did. And I think there's some applicability for any photographer that's out there. And then this, I think, is one of the biggest disclaimers. I actually had an opportunity to shoot with Jim one time, and he quoted this in a session. And I think it's so absolutely true that if you want to take interesting photographs, point your camera at something interesting, right? And then
absolutely
right, and get the technical side as close as you want. I guarantee you, on certain forums and so forth, people are going to pixel peep it and talk about there's noise over here in this shadow that's 2 EVs too low, and all that kind of stuff. In the meantime, they actually miss the opportunity to really get into the picture and get into the story of the picture that it might be telling about either nature or conservation. So this is a photograph on the Tallulah River above a little cabin I have up in North Georgia. And it was a fight over one small fish between two kingfishers. And if you blew this up 100% and went in and looked, I missed the focus in some places, but this is a favorite of mine because of the action shot. So I'm going to start off kind of on that theme. I call it getting more shots on goal. And it's doing the things that I've found successful to get more opportunities to take hopefully interesting bird and other wildlife photos. In the case of birders, this is said just about in every webinar, every book starts out with this. If you want to be a better bird photographer, become a better birder. And, you know, that makes sense. You learn more about the birds, their behaviors, the habitats, the times of year you're going to find, all of those things that go into putting you in the right place more times than not to get a good photograph. Or like Alexander, you could just be driving down the road, right, and get that fabulous barn owl. But most of the time, if you go through and really understand the birds, that really opens up the opportunities for better photograph. I put this thing about go birding with experienced birders, and Stephen and I have this kind of running joke that birders aren't always the most team playing folks. They're very competitive. And when they're out birding, they really are thinking about their life list and the list in that city or that county or that nature preserve, right? So they're going to move, and I move quite a bit. I don't shoot on a tripod, and I'll come to that a little bit later. But just understand, if you go birding with birders, or particularly on a birding trip, don't even pretend to make it a photography trip. You're not going to be able to stop and work the photo like you probably should without them getting upset.
Right.
Then the other, you know, the old saying in general photography, I think holds really true, you know, when you're close, get closer. Now, with bird and wildlife photography, there's oftentimes a physical constraint. There's a body of water between you and the subject. And there's this ethical one. And this, I'm really big on this. I've watched people out at the river walk, right, Buddy, where that owl nest was one time. People would climb up on the railing, you know, and try to get a shot of the birds and the owlets in the nest as a selfie, you know, and that kind of stuff just bugs the crap out of me. But the closer you get, the more detail. And I think one of the things that people tend to not quite understand, the reason I shoot really long lenses with a 2-crop factor, it's not so much to get the picture of the bird that's 1.5 miles away, right? Because you're going to have all sorts of atmospheric stuff in the way, and particularly in the Southeast where the humidity is 200%, right? But when you have a really good reach and you're close, the magnification really helps you out, because that's what really brings, you know, the feather detail out if you've got it lit properly, or if the sun's working to your advantage. Another kind of running joke with Stephen is I do wear camo quite a bit. I think it helps. I think the key to it is just drab clothing.
Drab, yeah.
Right. And but I put this note in here. I've told Stephen, one of the reasons I wear camo is because you can get really great functional, durable outdoor clothing from the hunting shops at a lot less price than you're going to pay for Patagonia or something
Yeah.
like that, right?
I think I've got 8 identical outfits now of all the exact same camo pants and shirts.
Right.
And that's it.
Right. And if you're out there, and if you're really in, you know, this shot I was down kind of in the water some, you know, down on my knees. And, you know, if I mess up a pair of on sale Cabela's camo pants or
Right.
Carhartt, you know, I really don't care. I just go
Right.
get a cheap pair, right? And this is a plug for anybody who's watching, you know, the people watching from Georgia. We have multiple great states of Georgia. We got the Northwest Valley and Ridge. We got the Northeast, where we've got the foothills of the Appalachians, and you go down to the coastal plain, Piedmont, the longleaf pine savannas down in southwest Georgia. And so getting out and exploring is one of the things I really like about birding and bird photography. It gets in a lot of different places. And I'm going to make a plug. Georgia has over 130 plus wildlife management areas. And if you can go to them, they're not just for hunting, but if you go, make sure it's not during hunting season. But buy a hunting and fishing license for Georgia. That's your entry fee into these wildlife management areas, but also the excise money that hunters and fishermen spend on their gear is sent back to the states based on proportional hunting license and fishing license. So it's a way for birders and bird photographers to help pay for their share of the conservation investments that the state of Georgia and others make in the wildlife management area. And so we're not totally freeloading when we're out there enjoying our
Yeah,
time.
and Alexandria, Georgia, our state is just about the same size as the UK, minus about half of Scotland.
Yeah, it's a lot of people. It's the second largest state east of the Mississippi, right? And we do have these just beautiful watersheds, the Ottamaha's. You know, when you're deep in the Ottamaha River Basin, it's close to the type of thing you'll find on the Amazon and so forth. And then we got the high Appalachian ridge lines that are really unique, and each one of them have a different range of birds that either migrate through or are residents there. So you can get a large variety of birding done. So once you're out there and you got opportunity, try to make the most of it. And I'm going to start off with focus and just make a couple of little points about it that I've found helpful. And one is cameras get marketed a lot by, we've got 121 in the case of my Olympus, some of the Nikons and Stevens big Canons, I don't know how many focus points they might have when they turn it all on. But one of the things to keep in mind is oftentimes the camera, when it's doing autofocus, will like something better than what you're pointing it at in order to focus on it because it's more contrasty or so forth. So this is one of these places where I think it helps the photographer take control away from the camera a little bit. And in my case, Olympus allows you to set different focus area sizes. And mine is set on the smallest focus area possible. And I started out in the center because when we're shooting really long like we do, just finding the bird in the frame sometimes can be a huge challenge, right? So I put it there so I can find it. But one of the neat things on cameras is that you can move a variety of ways. I have a joystick, or I can do it on the LCD, where I can move that focus point somewhere in the frame, maybe at an intersection on the rule of thirds grid, and stick it, and then move over and line that up with the eye, the bird's eye, and then shoot. Because I'm going to talk about this a little bit later too. The focus and reframe that that you'll hear a lot about in general photography sessions and so forth creates a real problem for us when we're shooting long because our depth of field is so shallow. So if you focus the center right on the bird's eye and then move your lens over a little bit in order to put the bird in the right-hand third, wherever you want to put them, you could very well just be totally out of focus with that bird. So I find it helpful to get a shot and then work the shot. And by working the shot, I'll move the focus point around until I can find the right composition I'm looking for. And I know that as soon as I hit, and I use back button focus too, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So as soon as I stick the focus on my back button, that focus point, it's locked in there. And I can shoot the shot and get the composition I want or close to the composition.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm glad you talked about that because I've never done that. And for those that don't know what the rule of thirds is, it's 3 horizontal sections and 3 vertical sections dividing your screen into thirds. And the intersection of those sections is where you want your subject to be on a properly framed image according to the rules. So you actually move your focus point, and you use single point focus like a lot of us do.
Right.
So you move your focus point to nearby one of those intersections so that your composition is naturally adherent to the rule of thirds, even when you just take the photo.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I also believe as much as you can, and I'll talk about this some more, is get the best shot that you can in camera, and don't always rely on being able to fix it in post.
Very important. Very important. Good advice.
And so almost, all of the good cameras, and everybody's shooting good cameras these days compared to what I started out with. That's for dang sure. Typically has a way to put whatever composition grid lines you want inside of the frame, right? So I keep mine on rules of third. You can do the golden triangle. There's any host of ways that you can think about composition. But the key is, for me, is to have that grid visible in the frame through the viewfinder, put the focus point wherever the rule makes it most helpful, the rule of thirds or the golden triangle, wherever it is, and shoot. And don't get in the habit of shooting or focusing and then recomposing, because you're going to lose the really critical vital focus because of our depth of field challenges. So,
and that combined with what you said earlier about not trying to shoot far away subjects because you have a zoom lens, but shooting closer in on near subjects with your super zoom lens is also a great combination with what you're saying. Because I find myself a lot earlier using a center focus point for whatever I'm shooting, and then cropping it into the rule of thirds when I get home, which is a detriment to your image. So, and you're saying properly framed and take an image before any processing is critical to bumping up your quality.
Yeah, I think so. And also, I do a lot of cropping. I mean, no matter what you try to do to get close to certain species, you're not going to be able to do it. So you're going to have to crop to get any sort of reasonable subject to frame ratio in it. And if you started out with them in the right place in the frame, when you crop, they stay there. So your aspect ratio and everything stays the same. You don't get in the situation where you focused on the bird, you want to crop down and you cut the tail off because it's too close to the edge or something like that. So just getting it right in camera really helps you out a lot when you do the inevitable post-processing.
Well, all the rest of us in here, all 3 of us have a history of astrophotography where the rule of thirds is irrelevant, and it's always centered. The image subject you're taking a picture of is centered. And I wonder if maybe we could apply the rule of thirds a little bit to some of our astro images. I'll have to look into that, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, I actually did that, and I'm a rank amateur compared to you guys, but when I was up in the mountains this summer, when Jupiter and Saturn were coming up, and they were kind of to the southwest, but the Milky Way was kind of to the southeast. And I put Jupiter on one intersection in the rules of third, and then the Milky Way came down the other rule of third line. And so that was a real amateurish attempt to use rule of thirds, and I won't call it astrophotography, but night photography.
Yeah, well, when we're using these little tiny astronomy cameras in a very high focal length telescope, there's no option for rule of thirds. You're lucky to get it anywhere in the frame. And and we're centering on subjects that might be the size of the eye of a hummingbird at 100 yards. So rule of thirds doesn't come into play much, but that's another lecture topic.
Right. So, well, a normal photography, try to get your composition as close as you can.
And there's also nothing behind anything we're shooting, so there's nothing to
Right.
rule of thirds about.
Right. Right. And then you also that thing about you focus and you look over and there's a garbage can behind you, so you try to move, all that kind of stuff. But this thing about depth of field is something I think is really important. And I use the example when you shoot my camera, and I'm within 40 feet, right? You get 7.5 inches of depth of field. And this is a picture of a robin. I took a robin's 8 to 11, right? So in this picture, I don't know if it shows up, after it's gone through everything, that the beak is actually in pretty good focus, but because of depth of field, the tail is you're running out of focus just on the robin, right? Now you can use that if you want to be artistic, or you can tell people you were doing it to be artistic, right? Which I might do every once in a while. But then the other part of it is it is this idea of subject isolation and so forth. And the eyes are sharp. So what if the tail's not in focus? But understanding this helps you be more intentional, because there will be times when you want entire bird in focus. So you're going to have to work with your depth of field to get that done.
I have a question here, Steve. The depth of field, is that on each side of the focal point, forward and behind it, or does it start at the focal point and go backwards, or what?
It's about a third in front. It's the amount of area that's in quote acceptable focus, right?
Right.
So if when I try to get the eye here, of the 7.5 inches, 1 or 2 of those is just in front of the robin, and then the focus goes down another 5 inches or so, and then it starts getting out of focus again.
Because I spent some time using smaller apertures to increase my depth of field, and I would try to focus on the center of the subject as far as distance from me goes, hoping that it was spread in front and behind, but it doesn't seem to be an equal spread.
It's not equal. It's a little less in front. It's about a third in front and 2/3 in back.
Is that always the case, you think, or is that?
That's well, you can get into these, I'll call them absurd, maybe because I don't always understand them. You get into what's called circle of confusion, and what's acceptably sharp and not. But for the most part, that's what I understand. That's the kind of, and that's how hyperfocal distance works, right? Is if you set your focus in a landscape photo about a third of the way in, you should, and you're shooting a real small aperture, a real large f-stop number, you should get a third of the picture in focus in front, your front of your subject, and then everything behind that to affinity. If you do,
I did not know that. Thank you.
Yeah. So if you're trying to get the foreground, if you want the foreground sharp, and you got another subject back there that you're really trying to focus on, you really got to work with hyperfocal distance to get that front third where you need it to be. Right. Now let's talk about exposure a little bit, and hopefully this is one that I won't be too pedantic about this. But I'm gonna start off by saying one of the things that I wanted to do, because Stephen and I have talked about this, is I think there's a lot of confusion out there about ISO. And it's understandable, I think, when you think about it, because when digital came on the scene, there was a standard that established the speed of the film. And the speed of the film was basically a measure of how sensitive it was to the light that it was being exposed to. And the higher, the higher the ISO speed or ASA speed, if you're as old as I am, the more sensitive, the more light, no, the chemical reactions allowed you, when you were processing the negative, to lighten it up, that the size of the crystals and so forth were such that you actually gathered more light, and you could use that light to lighten your final image from your negative. And I just butchered that. That was simplistic versus simple. But the thing that happened was when digital came along, in an attempt to keep everything kind of smooth in the transition and help people make the transition, a lot of concepts were moved to the digital world that were really about the film, and ISO is one of them, right? So in Nikon, right, when you look at their button setups and so forth, their menu setups, they talk about ISO sensitivity to make it sound like speed and film sensitivity, because what ISO does do, and we'll talk about this a little more in depth, is it lightens the sensor data through amplification that makes the final image brighter. So it resembles film in speed, but it's not exactly the same thing, right? Now, if you just go down the thing about, keep your ISO low and everything, you get great shots, right? But I think that if you really understand what's going on with ISO in the digital world, and some of the things that are happening with sensor technologies, that's actually coming out of a lot of your astrophotography guys, right? That a lot of the technologies that's reducing noise in sensor technology has come from the astrophotography guys, right? So in this slide, I want to make the point, exposure in its classic definition is simply the f-stop and the shutter speed or shutter duration. That's it, right? There's no sensor sensitivity. So when you read, and you'll read, it's everywhere because it's just taken on a life that you can't get rid of it. The exposure triangle, they'll say, well, exposure is made up of your f-stop, your shutter speed, and your ISO. No, right? No, it's your f-stop and your shutter speed. And that's what captures the photons that hit the sensor that generates the electric voltages that go all the way through the rest of the pipeline.
That's exactly right.
Right, that's it. And I say this in a couple of places here, but once that shutter closes, that's it. You don't get any more photons, right? And all the photons that you got, the good ones and the little random bad boys that's come in because of light, that's it. And so from that point on, if you're going to lighten the final image to some acceptable lightness that you want, right? Things start happening inside the camera. And one of them is the ISO, which is an analog amplification of the photons that you captured. So ISO does not change the sensitivity of the sensor, so that if you raise the ISO, you're going to capture more light. Or if you lower the ISO, you're not going to capture more light and blow your highlights. That's just not what's going on. It's simply an amplification. And what's really important about that is when it amplifies the sensor data, the voltages and so on, it amplifies the signal and it amplifies the noise.
Yes, it is.
Right? And so what's happening when you raise ISO is you're not adding noise, you're not adding shot noise, right? You're just making it more visible because you lightened everything. You lighten the signal, you lighten the noise, so now you see it, right? And perception's reality in this case. So particularly in the shadow area, you might not have seen it because it was just too dark. Well, when you lighten that shadow, all the noise that's in there comes with it. And it goes on. Now, there's also some things here that is really important. And let me go to this slide. So if you've got a dark image and you're looking through your viewfinder and it's just too dark, right? That's not what you want. Everybody said, well, raise your ISO, right? Well, what you're really doing is you're brightening that image. And that sounds really pedantic, but it's important, I think, to understand because when you alter the brightness, there are multiple ways to do it. One is the analog amplification I talked about before. You just amplify the voltages that are coming to you from in the sensor. But the other way that you can do it, or in addition to that, is inside of your JPEG processing. You can change the tone curves to brighten the image that just came out of the analog amplifier. And that is what the ISO standard is all about. It's about amplification and any digital work that's done on the data in the camera. Because the ISO standard is only for JPEG images. It explicitly does not concern itself with RAW files. The ISO has nothing to do with the raw file data in terms of the standard, because the standard is about that final image over there. And what the standard says is when you get through all the processing and you get to this final image, JPEG image, or it could be a TIFF or something else, as long as it's sRGB, you camera manufacturer are responsible for making sure that final image has an acceptable perceived lightness, which is defined by just about everybody as being someplace in that photo, the right mid-tone maps to middle gray. And that middle gray is really important to metering because that's telling everybody or everything in the camera that you're shooting for making something that you're looking at middle gray, and then everything else is brighter than that or darker than that. Yeah. And so this, to me, this is really important because when people say, well, when I raise my ISO, it's just making my picture too noisy. Well, no, what it's doing is it's taking your exposure that you made, right? You control that, and it's lightening it or darkening it to get to something around middle gray at some place in that image. It should be middle gray, or the camera thinks it should be middle gray. That's that automated stuff. It's trying to do the thinking for you, and that's where it is, right? And that could be good. It could be bad, but usually it's bad, and I'm going to explain why, because
Hey, we've got our first porn person busting into our meeting here, by the way. Sorry to interrupt you. We're so legit now that we've got jerk offs on here busting in with their porn. Let me remove this guy. Sorry about that.
no problem.
Thanks, Jessica. We appreciate it.
Okay, so I hope I haven't been being too pedantic about that, but all of this is working to try to get something that the camera manufacturer or the engineers think is a pretty nice JPEG image. That's what it's all about. And if you lighten your exposure in that JPEG image, it's going to make the noise more visible.
Right.
And so once you've established that signal to noise ratio at exposure, all that happens from that point on is it gets more visible, or maybe less visible, depending on what you're
Yeah,
trying.
I'll relate it to, if you don't mind, to our Astro cameras, where it's called gain
Right.
and gamma, which are both the same thing as ISO. And you mentioned there's another way to increase is what we do.
Yeah, you're stealing my show.
Oh, sorry about that.
But that's a good segue.
Yeah, but gain, it's called gain and gamma in astronomy. We try not to use it, and that's the absolute last resort for an astro image, only when everything else has failed. So I kind of think of ISO that way as well.
Well, and it should, and that's why the old use the lowest ISO that you can. Yes, that makes a lot of sense, right? But you shouldn't be afraid of it either if you kind of know what's going on. And there are times, but in bird photography, right, that we have to be, and we are always being very sensitive to shutter speed. And I'll come to that in a minute. So it's not just getting the most detail in the lightest image, or you could just set your shutter duration to be 30 seconds or somewhere, whatever it is, like you astro guys do. In birding, we have a couple of constraints.
In birding, you have a couple of.
Let me get rid of this guy too. Sorry, everybody. We've never had any hackers before, and we've had 5 in the last 10 minutes. So nobody else is getting it.
So this is another way to look at it, because I recommend, and Stephen, I've heard you do this over and over again right now, because I agree with you, shoot raw, right?
Yep.
And do a lot of this changing of color curves and brightness and lightness and so forth in the software, where you got a lot of computing power to do it, and more sophisticated software, and you're controlling the sliders and not an Olympus engineer, right? So backtrack a little bit. Here's the concept of shot noise. It's the photon noise that's in the shot. It's inherent. It's boy, I'm really going out on a limb with Alexandra on this call. It's there's a randomness to the distribution of the photons and all that kind of stuff. But basically, at the end of the day, when the shutter closes, you got some good photons and you kind of got some bad photons stuck in there as well. And there is some read noise that'll come along. The sensor has to change a couple of things in order to open the pixels back up and so forth. And then downstream, you get electronic noise that might pop up in your analog to digital converter. All those things are there. And this is one of the places where the truisms about ISO have kind of stuck from the film days and haven't really taken into account the changes in the technology, because cameras now, right, the read noise is going down, almost approaching zero, particularly the downstream noise. And there's something called ISO invariance there that basically says the pipeline's not introducing a lot of electronic noise, so you can shoot as dark as you want and then brighten it in post and do it digitally, right? Because you're not brightening electronic noise artifacts in the newer cameras, or the cameras are getting real close to it. So, kind of summarize what we're trying to do is get. Let me just go here. What we're trying to do is get the best possible exposure. It's got as many photons on that sensor as we can possibly get.
Absolutely.
Without blowing our highlights, right? You can only get so much done, or so much light on that sensor. And you got to make sure that you've got the shutter speed that you want for whatever effect you're trying to do, in that particular image. So, Stephen, you're right. So if I increase ISO a stop in a semi-automatic mode, right, and I shoot aperture, and I'll explain it in a minute. If you go up in ISO, you go down in exposure. And that's exactly what you don't really want to do, right? Because you go down in exposure, you're getting a lower signal to noise ratio, which when you come back and brighten it to that ISO standard, you added more, you made more noise visible.
Exactly.
Right. So that's what really gets people, oh man, ISO is terrible, right? And you don't want it, right? Always use the lowest one. But if you think about it for a minute, you can take some steps to so that it's not as bad as it could be. And the reason for that is, is down here, is ISO is not going to add a lot of read noise later. And it's actually the lower signal to noise ratio that you're seeing and perceiving as more noise. So I'll repeat myself again, that the idea is get the best exposure you can on your sensor, right? So keep your signal to noise ratio high. That's keeping your exposure high. And if you're not blowing highlights, you're not overexposing. And that's another, this idea of underexposing and overexposing and so forth is another thing that's kind of come out of film in the low dynamic ranges of our old slide days. And I'll go back to that middle gray. The meter is trying to set a correct exposure of middle gray as the midpoint of your midtones. And if your picture is really bright, you might not be overexposing. That might be exactly what you're looking for, right? You might want to have it that bright for any number of artistic reasons. And the other part is you've got more exposure. So if it's really, really bright, that's okay because you got more details too, right? You can then come into post-processing and bring it down, bring it down a little bit in post-processing, but you've kept your really high signal to noise ratio versus bumping your signal to noise ratio down in order to have less light, right? So as I say here, there's always some buts. Keep your signal to noise ratio high, right? Get as wide an aperture as you can, keep it open as long as you can, get all the photons you can. But if you do that, you can blow the highlights in a really bright scene luminance, a lot of sunshine and a lot of reflection off of buildings or any other specular kind of highlights. Your sensor can only take so much light and then it just clips it. It just,
saturation occurs, yeah.
Right. It just can't store it anywhere, right? I mean,
any data over saturation is lost from the image. So
right. It's gone too, right? I mean, that's not a post-processing thing you can fix.
No, and it's interesting because the human eye can have different portions of the same frame at different levels of brightness
right.
naturally, but the camera cannot. That's the only downfall of the chip compared to the human eye. is that whatever it sets for that is the entire frame. Like we can look at the moon and the foreground at the same time and see both of them in perfect exposure, but a camera could never do that so
Right.
far.
You've seen some of my moon shots, I think.
Not just yours, everyone's.
Right. And the other, the other thing that we, as birding photographers or wildlife photographers, always have to keep in mind is camera shake or subject movement.
Yeah.
Particularly when we're shooting as long as we are, right? When you got that lens sitting out there at 600 to 800 millimeters, just a coffee tweak, just a little jitter, right, will show up. I mean, it'll be camera shake blur, right? And it's movement blur. If you're taking pictures of kinglets, 9 out of 10 shots is going to be blur, right? Somewhere the bird, he or she's gone, right? And that depth of field thing creeps back in, right? Because when we're shooting really long at really wide open apertures, we're shooting a lot of out of focus, out of depth of field, right? But I say, okay, don't worry, these don'ts if you don't want to, right? You might want a certain amount of motion blur. Like I don't like my hummingbird pictures to be totally frozen. The guys that use the flash and different things. I like to have my wingtips with a little bit of motion blur because that's a hummingbird, right? I mean, it adds to the picture sometimes. And I've also oftentimes, if I'm going to blow highlights, I'll really blow them and just do a real highlight oriented focus. I'll just blow the whole background sometimes. And the bird, is the right lightness and everything else is just blown, right? And that's one look. And I've done the same thing on darkness, right? If you can shoot in the shadows, sometimes you get the bird, the right lightness, and just push everything in the background black. Just shove your shadows way down there somewhere to do it. That's the beauty of shooting raw and thinking about some of this stuff. You're in control and not the camera engineer. So my strategy overall is to expose for the motion effect. That's kind of one of the keys here. To freeze the birds on the perches or get them in flight where they're not, right? And the highlights, because of what we said earlier. If you blow a highlight, you can't get it back. If it's a little too dark in your shadows, you can raise the shadows some, right, and play around with them. And particularly now with topaz, the noise, right, Stephen?
Yay, topaz!
Right, you can raise those up, hit them with topaz, and knock the noise kind of out of the shadows. It's like getting 2 extra stops, I think, of sensor technology. So the practical side of that is I try as much as I can to expose to the rightish or to the leftish, and I put the ishes in there because the technical fanatics would argue, and they're right, that exposing to the right only works when you're at base ISO. And what exposing to the right is, you're trying to move all your photons, if you think about your histogram, as far right as you can, get as many of your tones in the highlights as you can without clipping them off, right? So you can just kind of visibly think about that histogram moving over to the right, and that's exposing to the right. And when you do that, what you're doing is you're up in exposure, right? You're gathering, to do that physically, you're gathering more light in, right? You're getting more photons on that sensor, and you're getting a better signal to noise ratio. So the more you can expose to the right without clipping the highlights, or I should say clipping the critical highlights, the better your signal to noise ratio is going to be, and the less visible noise you're going to have in the final image. But because of that shutter speed dilemma that we have and so forth. So oftentimes you can't get the shot that you want motion wise at base ISO. If you just don't have enough light in the scene, right? You're shooting into the shadows at Clyde Shepherd deep down in.
That's when you have to buy a more expensive lens.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Rather than boosting the ISO one stop, $10,000 for a lens would be the obvious choice.
Yeah, but then you get into some other interesting compromises, right? When you're
yes,
pushing
you
it
do.
down, right? When you push it down into f4, so not only is the price going up, but your depth of field is just going to centimeters, right?
Right.
And it weighs 20 pounds if you're shooting at 600 or so. And that's one of the reasons. I'll give a plug to the Olympus in a minute about that, because I shoot handheld all the time. I don't own a tripod anymore, right? And I don't use my monopod very much. But the point here I'm trying to make is that one of the things I try to do is balance my need with ISO for a shutter speed that stops the motion or stops the handshake a little bit, with trying to get back some of that exposure using my exposure compensation, right? And I'm going to start off this next section about how I do that practically by saying everything I'm about to say a little bit later from now is not as bad as it's going to sound, because I take a lot of the settings I'm going to talk about and I store them in custom modes that are available to me on my Olympus, and Stephen, I know Canon has them and Nikon has the different names, right? But
yeah, we have exposure compensation on the Canon.
I know, but and I forget what they call them, but you can take go in your menu, set everything up, right, the way you want it, and then save it in camera so that on your mode dial.
Oh yeah.
Right. And I'll show a picture of this. So I've got some very basic ones, perch birds that aren't moving around too much, perch birds that are moving around, doing so forth. And Olympus has this new artificial intelligence tracking that's really, really cool. But if I'm doing birds in flight, I have totally different settings, and I store them in these custom modes. But I have it set up, and I'm sure the other cameras allow you to do this as well, is they're a fingertip away, right? I don't have to go to the mode dial. I can just ping and I go to C1 or C2 or C3 based on what I'm seeing or what I'm anticipating. I want to see, like when I walk up to the observation deck at Clyde Shepherd, I go ahead and put it in birds in flight, then hoping that, the heron's going to fly in, or, ritual, just trying to think ahead a little bit and those kind of things. And also in each of the custom settings, I'll put ISO in its own dial, and it's right next to my back button focus. So in this picture, you see it's right under my thumb. So if I want to up my ISO, I just move it to the right. One click, and it's one stop of ISO, to, that type of thing. And then under my index finger is my exposure compensation. And I'll talk about why that's important in a minute. So I can change my exposure, and I can change my exposure composition when my right hand never go anywhere. So they're right there under my right hand. When
quickly accessible while looking through the viewfinder.
Right, you would keep your eye on the viewfinder, because I had a hard enough time finding the bird in the viewfinder to begin with, right? I don't want to lose it. And when I do, I never find them again. Then what, I must not have put, oh, I didn't put it here. I should have. I want to make a real quick point here. My exposure composition, I have it set up that it does 1/3 stop steps. So when I turn it once, it goes 1/3 of a stop. ISO, I do a whole stop. And the reason I do that is because on almost every single camera, ISO fraction stops between 100 and 200 and 200 and 300. Those fractions in between are not real ISO, they're digital ISO. Remember when I said the manufacturer has a lot of discretion about how they brighten the photo? The camera manufacturers use this digital amplification, which means it amplifies everything. So you're better off setting your camera up so it only changes ISO and whole stops, and stay away from the fractional stops. So tactically, I shoot aperture priority for non-birds in flight. I will switch over to shutter speed priority, shutter priority for birds in flight more times than not. And the reason I do it is simple. Back to exposure, f-stop is one of the two parameters in exposure. So I just set it at wide open. And that's another reason to buy one of those expensive lenses, right? The ones that have really good f-stops, they're almost always sharp, wide open. And that's a big deal. And not all lenses are, and a lot of lenses, particularly the kit lenses and some others, you're usually better off stopping down, maybe a stop or so. That'll be the sharpest aperture on a lot of lenses. And that's one of the things that started another one of the truisms about always shoot at f8. When you do it, that'll be the sharpest. F8 and be there and all those kind of things. No, the lenses these days, you can get really sharp lenses that are shooting wide open. And so once you put it wide open, that's as big as it's going to get. And that's part of exposure that's taken care of. You don't have to think about it anymore, right? It's as big as it's going to get. So now all you have to worry about is how long the shutter stays open, right? And in my aperture priority, and it's something true of almost every camera, when you put it in aperture priority, it's going to want to choose a shutter speed that's the highest shutter speed that gets you, quote, the correct lightness. Remember, it's that middle gray thing for a given ISO. So it's going to start at what it thinks is the most appropriate high shutter speed. And that could, but more likely is not the shutter speed that you're going to want for the picture that you want to take. Okay, the slides got out of order, right? So this is a little bit of a recap in some ways. Some of the things that I do, I call them one and done. I just do them in the menus, put them in those custom modes. And I never look back at them. One is I go in my camera, and every camera has some ability to do this. I shut off all the JPEG variables that are in there to make the JPEG pop, that kind of stuff, right? I put it in the muted profile. I get rid of all contrast, I get all saturation, I get rid of sharpness, I get rid of all of it, right? And the reason for that is it makes the histogram that you're seeing a little more accurate for establishing your raw exposure, right? It's not trying to lighten the photo to be this really bright, popping, what the engineer thinks sells the camera better, right? It's just a plain dullness. So it's getting about as close to raw as you can get. right? Now, the caveat to that is when you look at it on live view, or if you look in the electronic viewfinder, it's going to look like crap, right, when you're doing that. But I don't do any editing or thinking about that in camera anyway, right? The resolution of the viewfinders, that's just not a good place to do it. If I look in there and it's just pure crap, the bird's looking on the other direction, or there's a big limb behind it, I go ahead and delete it or something like that. But if it looks reasonably close, I keep it until I can put it on the computer. The other thing that I do is the camera allows you to set the tonal values that you want from 0 being total black to 255 being white. And anything, like we've been saying, anything beyond 255 is gone, right? So that sets the tonal range. Then what I do is I back the 255 down to 245. And the reason I do that is that reestablishes on the histogram where the highlights are going to clip. And it basically is giving me a little headroom in there, because I really don't want to clip a highlight that's really important. So I give myself a little bit of room. And it's the same thing about blinkies, which is basically a visualization inside of your viewfinder. If it's blinking red, that means your histogram has values to the right of 255. If it's mine case, I said if it's real blue, it's too dark, right? It's on the other side of black. So this gives me a little bit of room for this next point about blinkies. I'm going to talk about that a lot in a minute. But I turn blinkies, my blinkies are always on, no matter which mode I'm shooting in. And here's the point I made, I forgot where I'd put it. My EV changes are always 1/3 stop, and the ISO changes are always whole stops. And that's in the menu, right? I set it and forget it. Now, in setting up the shot and taking the shot, here's some tactics that I use. One is I spot meter most of the time, probably 90+% of the time. And I've connected that spot meter to my focus area. And remember, I talked about I shoot the smallest focus area as I can, and I move that focus area depending on how I want to compose it. And the reason I do that is, this idea is the subject that's most important to get the exposure correct. And thankfully, for almost all the birds we shoot right around here, in the little sunbirds, they're almost always, from a tonal quality point of view, right, middle gray. That's kind of part of their camouflage. They don't want to stick out too much, right? Now, if you go down to the Amazon, they got everything, that's all about, showing off and getting a better mate and so forth. But most of our birds and so forth are going to be around that middle gray, which is fortunate. And like I said, if I move the focus point, not only am I getting the focus right in the composition, I'm also getting the exposure metering I want on that subject at that particular place in the frame. So if I move it, I don't have to worry about, oh, it's over in this brighter place or it's darker. I'm still focused on the subject, right? So when I start messing with my exposure composition, it's still worried about metering on that bird. And that's really important too in a lot of what we do. No matter how close we get, a lot of times the bird's going to be a real small part of the overall frame. That's just how it is, right? That kinglet's way up the top, or that pine warbler's, way out over on a limb, and you just can't get it right. So focus on him and set the EVs, the exposure values on the bird. and you're gonna, you're gonna get collateral damage. There's gonna be probably some specular highlights over somewhere that's, bright lights bumping off of something. There'll be, some deep shadows over here like this picture. And that can be good or bad, right? But if you get the focus and exposure right on the subject, then you can start playing around with some of the other ones, kind of like I did here. I got real fortunate that the light was all in the same plane and the focus was all in the same plane. So that Mockingbird's a perfect example, nice middle gray, set the exposure on that. That picked everything else up and just sent the shadows way down dark. And then when I put it in post exposure, I darken them even some more. So when I go in the field, I already have an idea based on where I'm going and what I think I'm going to see and what's going on, where I want to put my manual ISO. I don't use auto ISO. I set it manually. And like I said, it's right under my thumb. So it's not a big deal. I just move it right or left to get the exposure and some things that I kind of start out with. If it's a bright, open, sunny day, the rule of 16s works pretty good. So I just put it at base. If I'm at Clyde Shepherd, I'm in the forest, or I'm out someplace and it's overcast, I'll put it at 400, 800 or so of deep forecast. I'll put it at 1600. I very, very seldom shoot above 1600 because if it's that dark, you're gonna have a pretty crappy photo anyway. And then one of the things I say here, testing in between. So if I put it on, I walk into Clyde Shepherd, I put it on 400, and I see what my exposure is going to be. And if the shutter speed is a little too close to what I want it to be, or too low, I'll bump it to 800 and see what happens, right? See what happens with the shutter speed. Because remember, what's going to happen is if you go from 400 to 800, one stop of ISO, your shutter speed and aperture priority is going to be cut in half. You're going to lose a stop of shutter speed, right? So I'd stand there and look and focus on a leaf or something and just see what the heck's kind of going on. And I try to do that periodically, while I'm out in the field. So once I got that manual ISO set up, then I use my exposure compensation to raise or lower, almost always raise the exposure a third stop. So basically what I'm doing is I set the ISO up one stop, which decreases my exposure one stop. And then I try to get that exposure back in increments of a third until I get back pretty close to where I wanted to be in the shutter speed. Now, if you get it all set up in your base ISO and you're shooting 3,000, a second, and that's okay too. So this is mostly about when you're in dark and, a lot of areas where we're birding is to bump your ISO up to a place where you're just getting about a stop or so above what you want your shutter speed to be, and then kind of crawl your way back a third of a stop at a time, watching your blinkies. Because if you bring back a third of exposure and nothing's blinking, go to 2/3. Now, if something's blinking over here that you don't really care about, that's fine. Go, right, do it again. You remember, because it's right under my index finger, go to a full stop of exposure compensation. And if you're still not blowing any highlights on the bird, or, something right in the vicinity of the bird that you don't want to blow, you're good to go, right? And you got the shutter speed you want. Hit the shutter button. Oh, that that's it. And, I've covered a lot. And Stephen, you've been kind of quiet. So,
I have lots of questions, but I'm listening to what you're saying.
okay. Well, that's all right. So far away. The only way I know, what's important is for you to tell me what's important through a question.
Right. So a lot of people don't realize that exposure compensation doesn't do anything in manual mode, and metering modes, etc. Now you shoot an aperture priority most of the time, you say, and I know some other people that do as well. But you actually have a reason for shooting in aperture priority mode, which I like. So you're allowing the camera to automatically choose the best exposure value based on your set ISO, and then you're using exposure compensation to tweak that a little bit. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I spent, what, better part of an hour saying what you just said, but that's right.
Yeah, well, you actually gave the details why. I'm just summarizing. And I like to shoot in manual mode, and I have a reason for it too, because I just like to fully control it. I like to fully control the exposure and the ISO, and there's pluses and minuses for all of them. But
let me ask you something then, Stephen, because this is one that I hear a lot. How do you decide what your aperture and shutter speed is going to be?
I decide what my aperture is going to be based on the light. If it's a sunny day, I use f7.1 almost always, even on my f4 lenses, because I'm interested in depth of field more from the aperture than anything. That's more important to me than even, than other things. And the ISOs that you were using are exactly right, but I base my choice of focal length on the available light, because ideally I'd want most of the time I want the biggest depth of field I can get, because I'm usually shooting far off subjects with an f4 lens, and like you said, it's paper thin depth of field. But there's the proof is in the pudding. I mean, the photos in your slideshow are immensely better than any photos I take. So.
That was actually a little bit of a trick question. I mean, what you're doing is right. I mean, if you've got a long experience and you kind of understand what's going on in the scene in terms of the exposure values in the scene, the sunny days, overcast days, all those things, you certainly, you can shoot manual, and a lot of people do. But that's a lot of experience. When I hear a lot of people, they go to a class and they say, you're not a good photographer if you don't shoot manual, right? You're not a real photographer. So they put it in manual, and they'll set an aperture for whatever you want. And then they watch their meter down there, that shows them if they're over. Remember that thing about underexposing or overexposing?
Mm-hmm. I think you're almost always underexposed when you shoot all in manual.
Right. Right. But the interesting thing is that meter is part of the camera algorithms that's telling you what to set the shutter speed for. So those people aren't as in full control as they really think they are, right? They're not shooting Ansel Adams zone thing. They're still relying on the meter. So when I put mine in aperture priority and I put it on f4, on my f4 lens, the meter will set the shutter, right, speed, and it's exactly the same shutter speed that the person would get if they looked at the little thing in their viewfinder,
right,
and set the shutter speed so it was in the middle, right?
Right. So it's just choosing the shutter speed that puts you in the middle of the bar, while I'm looking at the bar and manually changing my shutter speed to be into the middle of the bar. So yours is a faster way to do the same thing.
Right. And the camera's still in control.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
So that's the reason I said I put it in aperture, put it on f4, because I know much is sharp, right? And I do have the advantage, I'm shooting 2x, so my depth of field is twice as much as your full format run. So that gives me a little room. And then if I'm that close to the bird, that's when I start saying, well, I really wanted the tail to be out of focus because I'm really into subject isolation and then I start all that kind of crap, right?
Well, another thing is that if you're using a fully manual mode and you're not using auto ISO, then your metering doesn't do anything. It's irrelevant what metering you use, because it's not choosing anything. You're choosing all the settings. White balance is controlled by something else, not the meter. And that, there's a lot of technical things about the camera that so-called experts, including myself, in the past have said, well, here's why I do this because this, and I've been wrong about it. And then once I learn a little bit more about listening to someone who knows what they're talking about, I'll change my settings. But using the aperture priority to have the camera select the proper exposure to put you in the middle of the graph, the middle of the bar in the viewfinder, and then using exposure compensation to either go above or below that as your own taste is an excellent reason to use aperture priority. And that's probably the only time I've ever heard an excellent reason to use it. So, and the proof is in the pudding. I mean, look at the photograph that's on here now.
Part of it though is that I want to emphasize, the blinky thing, and I went through this whole thing about setting 245.
Yeah,
really anal, but that's really important to give you this visualization of what's going on, right? You're standing in the woods, the birds are flying, I want to think about as few things as possible, right?
So that 245 and all that you were saying is straight out of astrophotography as well, because we try to get to the saturation point and then we back off a little bit on every pixel, because not only does it give you some room, but in post editing, some of those highlights, even though the camera thinks they're blown out, you might want to put them up just a little bit more. So if you've got it set right at 255, then you have no up room in editing, but you have lots of down room. But it's just such there are so many technical aspects of this chip sensor and the way the image is processed in the Canon Digic processor, it's called, I don't know what's called, Olympus, that almost no one bothers to learn about. And it really can make a significant improvement in your percentage of usable shots, which is the thing we use in wildlife photography. At first, I may have a $20,000 camera set up, but I'm getting one shot out of 300. That's even acceptable. But if you use the tools and understand what they're doing, like ISO, for instance, everything you said about ISO was right on the money, man. And trying to explain that to someone once they've hooked on, this is the way I shoot and I'm getting some pretty good photos here and I'm not going to change and I don't care what you had to say, is the general attitude you get. But really exploring all the different possibilities with the different settings is the way to go, and finding the one that you're the most comfortable with.
What I try to do is get it to muscle memory, right? So I don't have to remember everything I just said. Right? Get it? And that's the two, but you're exactly right. Let the camera set the correct exposure, right? Right. And then say, correct's not what I want. I want two more, I want another stop of exposure.
And to be direct, the exposure compensation actually changes the exposure. It doesn't change the ISO or anything else.
No, it basically, when you're in aperture priority, it changes the shutter duration, right?
Right. So it's actually changing a physical parameter, not a computer generated parameter. So you're actually, getting, what you said about the shutter opening and how long it's open being much more, it's way, way better to have a longer exposure if possible than to add any sort of gain or ISO or whatever you want to call it. And ISO, for those that don't know, by the way, stands for International Standards Organization. And it's doesn't it?
No, that's one of the, it's ISO. It's a Greek derivative word that it says the same. The ISO Standards Organization is a separate thing. As a matter of fact, you ever see?
We're going to disagree on that one.
No, I'll say, no, I've gone through over. The ISO people set the original film standard, but the ISO standard. ISO is a standard, and ISO is not an acronym. It's a Greek, and it talks about the same. And I'll send you some literature on that.
We're going to disagree on that one and move on. However, it doesn't matter what it stands for. It does not stand for internal sensitivity, which I've heard several people tell me. Chips, it's the internal sensitivity of the chip, ISO chip.
Right.
So it does not stand for that.
No.
And the other, the blinkies you're talking about, I think, you know, are the highlights that the camera will show on the screen. It will show you when you're beyond the saturation for that particular color or that area of the image. And they can be turned on and off on your camera. And it's a really, really valuable thing to use, even though it's very distracting to see when you first start to try to use it. And I know that most people I know turn that off and don't ever use it. But it's basically a quickie reference to your histogram. And the histogram, Alexandra will tell you, and maybe Buddy even will tell you, is probably the most valuable real-time tool in shooting photography, because the histogram really is where it's all at. And it's a bar from left to right. It shows blacks on the left and whites on the right, and shows you the number of pixels at each magnitude of your image. And, you know, when you're saying move it right or move it left, I understand totally what that means. But that's another thing on the camera that takes some time to figure out. It's not intuitive. It doesn't really mean anything if you don't know what it is. But once you learn to use it, it means everything. And we use it in astronomy to focus our images, because when your image is focused properly, your histogram is just beautiful right there in the middle with a nice parabola. And if you unfocus the image slightly, it just goes wacky all over the place. So it's used in lots of photography. Buddy, you had something to say?
Yeah, I had a question about the histograms. I've been reading some lately about most people look at the histogram and it's really the luminous histogram, but you can be your histogram can be okay, but if you're to the right, you might be blowing out your blues, and if you're to the left, you can be blowing out your reds.
Right. And histogram is a type of chart, is what it is. It's not you know, only in photography. It's used in all sorts of different things. But your histogram, just like your RGB values, you know, you can see it as a total value of RGB together, or you can see it as individual RGB values. And the histogram can be set, at least on my camera, to show just luminosity or red, green, and blue histograms overlapping each other. And you want to get all three of them kind of in the same spot as much as you can, and as high as you can without clipping, and in the center. You know, that's the point of the histogram. And it's amazing how much even focus will affect that in astronomy. Alexander, do you use the histogram when you're doing solar imaging or astronomy?
Yeah, I use it all the time for solar. Yeah, it's really important, because otherwise you can't tell where you are.
Yeah, so it's widely used in other types of photography, but, you know, it's not widely used in wildlife photography, I've seen. But then again, you know, Steve Rushing is, go ahead.
That's why, you know, you were saying, I don't put it in my viewfinder. It takes up space that I'd rather be actually looking at the image, right?
Right.
In real time. And that's why I use blinkies, right?
Right, exactly. That's what the blinky's for, to give you a reference to the histogram without taking up too much space.
Right. And it's interesting, different views. I want it to be distracting. That's why I have them.
Right. Well, I'm saying, when you don't know what it is, it's just something bothering you. But when you know what it is, it's a critical component of your imaging.
Right. And back, Buddy, to your point, absolutely true. You know, the different color channels actually are being mapped in their own individual histograms, and then they get smashed together in a camera. And remember, cameras don't have that much processing power relatively. But that was the point I was making. Regardless, that's the histogram for the JPEG image that the camera thinks it's producing, right? It has nothing.
Exactly right.
It has nothing to do with the raw data that you're capturing in the raw file, right? So the histogram and the blinkies are just an approximation of how much light you're putting into the data that's on that raw file. And
well, if it processes it according to your picture style setting, which also has nothing to do with your raw data, if you were to process it in the camera with that picture style setting, right, that's the resulting histogram.
Right. And that's why I turn all that crap off, right? and that's why my that's what, when I'm looking in the viewfinder or if I'm doing playback on my LCD, it looks like crap because I'm using muted profile. There's no contrast, nothing in the JPEG engine about it, right? Because I just say, okay, I'll put it on the computer and then I can see what happens in the.
Yeah, that's a very good point. You know, in solar imaging, and I've been doing that for a while, everybody wants their solar image that they're capturing. You know, you have a preview of what you're actually capturing. And in solar astronomy, we capture videos of thousands of frames or whatever, and then we stack those frames. But everybody wants the image to look like a finished image in the preview. And if you do that, it looks horrible after you've processed it. So you want to use these tools we're talking about and set your histogram properly, your exposure, et cetera, to get the most data possible, regardless of what it looks like when you're capturing. You want the most data you can get without overexposing. And then in the processing portion is where you make it look like an Alexandra Hart photo, you know. So that's a very good point, and that's an advanced topic that really astronomers have been doing the whole time. But you're the first person I've ever heard say that, you know, to explain that the image on your preview is irrelevant as long as you're getting the data that you want.
You want to cram that all those bits.
Yeah, man.
In that raw. And one last point, and this will be a plug for Olympus. Olympus 2 firmwares ago on one of my cameras, they call it Starry Night Focus. And they actually use exposure and the internal processing to establish the focus point on the stars. Yeah. And it's really helpful because not only does it put them in focus, it doesn't blow them. So the real star, it gets as close as we're going to get with these kind of cameras, not your kind of, to actually the real color of the stars. It is a slick.
Yeah, well, that's how we focus in astronomy. And you mentioned something about ADC on one of your slides way back when you convert from digital to analog or analog to digital. And in astronomy, we call that a bias. When you take a photograph with any astronomy camera or even with a DSLR in astronomy, you take what's called several bias frames that record the noise generated when you go from analog to digital and subtract that noise from the image. It's really incredible because it's just a few pixels here and there. But a bias is subtracted from your final image. And as we have something called flats also, where if the image is unevenly illuminated in one portion of the image, we'll unfocus it and take what's called a flat frame, which analyzes the uneven lightness and subtracts that from the final image also. So it's evenly illuminated all the way across. And that's something I haven't seen done in wildlife photography yet. But boy, I'm all over that. I want to find a way to do that. And you know, in solar astronomy, Alexandra and I have in the past put white plastic bags over the end of our telescopes to get the flat frame, it's called, which shows the uneven brightness. So, you know, 12, 15 years ago, nobody was doing solar imaging, and we and a guy, Alan Friedman in New York, we kind of developed all these techniques. And, you know, it's great how to see you, someone who has not done a lot of telescope and astronomy camera imaging, finding out on your own these same techniques and applying them to your wildlife photography. So I think that's awesome.
Well, some of the best papers I've read have come out of the astrophotography stuff about, you know, now I'm desperately trying to avoid another addiction. So
please do. And you want to talk about some non-social exclusionary jerks. You go to an astronomy club meeting, man, and it makes the worst birder you've ever met look like the friendliest person on earth. Am I right, Alexander? Just shake your head, you know.
As tech guys, Buddy and I know exactly what you're talking about. That's just one of our normal undergraduate classes at Tech.
Yeah. So, Buddy, do you have any other questions, or did you? Because you know, Buddy is a thinker, and he doesn't talk a lot, but he is a thinker, man, and he's got all this going on in that head of his, and I know he's you know, knows everything you talked about and then some. Well, you want to add something to it?
The only thing I had to add is basically a question. When you, I know you post the video up, Stephen, but can we post just Steve's slide deck also?
Yeah, I mean, what program did you use, Stevie? Keynote or PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Yeah, I could certainly put, if Steve will allow it, I could put the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Yeah, no,
If you'll send that to me, then I will be.
I'd be flattered if somebody tried to steal it, you know.
Well, I use Keynote. So I when I put up my Keynote, everybody's always asking me if they can borrow my solar presentations. And I say, well, it's 32 gigabytes and it's in Apple Keynote. So how do you want me to get it to you? Oh, what? Well, we can't use that. So yeah, maybe Steve will Dropbox that to me and I'll put a Dropbox link.
Yeah, I'll shoot it to you along with a reference that actually explains what ISO is.
Thank you for that. I look forward to that because I had it on my Google screen before I mentioned that, but I look forward. Let's see who Michelle is. I'm going to have to go ahead and disconnect this person too, probably. So this has been a first for Sunlit Earth. Let's see if this is some jerk wanting to do some garbage too. Yeah, I'm going to remove them too. We've never been hacked. And Steve, your show was so popular that we were hacked.
They were out there saying this thing needs some excitement. So.
Well, that's a first for me. So I'm going to start using a password, I guess, next week because we have it just totally opened up with no password. Alexandra, have you talked to the hubby about buying you at least a $30,000 rig for wildlife photography for Christmas? Christmas is coming up.
I don't think I'd get anywhere with that. No. Definitely not.
I don't know. I mean, with your talent and skills, anything less than the best is not acceptable to me. So.
No, I like going out with the birds and just watching them with binoculars.
Yeah, because you've really gone to the extremes with solar telescopes, and you have one of the best made and most expensive solar telescope setups on Earth. The Solar Scope Double Stack 100. Am I right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's the price of a new BMW at least.
Yeah, the hubby's just nodding.
There's the hubby.
I'm here.
Yeah.
Alexandria, you make a really good point. One of the things I try to do periodically, it goes back to I lived a feral childhood. I lived in the woods my entire growing up time, is put the camera. I know it's Clyde Shepherd now, not to leave it in the back of my car, but
Yes.
leave the camera and just go birdie. That's, I forget to do that enough, but I do that sometimes.
Yeah, that is good. And to be honest with you, I've been without a camera since for 5 weeks, and taking the binoculars out and walking through the woods is pretty fun.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, and I can also take my dog with me, and I love my little dog. You can't take the dog with the tripod; it's just not practical. But there's a lot to this binocular birding stuff, and I have been enjoying it. I do have the Canon 1DX Mark IIIs that came in. And for those that are thinking on that end, they have a built-in intervalometer for time-lapse usage, which I've been taking time lapses for 15 years. And that's part of the camera now. You used to have to buy an external intervalometer to plug into it. So for astronomy, they've got some really advanced features. And it's also got a touch screen on the back. I know every other company on Earth has had a touch screen for 10 years, but Canon has finally incorporated a full touch screen on the back. So when you put it in mirrorless mode, it is the best mirrorless camera on the market, even though it's not a mirrorless camera. But when you put it in mirrorless mode, it is. Steve's going to disagree with me on that one too. Go ahead.
No, actually, the Canon is getting great reviews. But there are, I said I wasn't going to plug, there are some things that all cameras make compromises about, and others. So it's finding which compromises you can live with. Like I shoot handheld, but Olympus, I get 7.5 stops of stability between the camera and the lens. And this is set up for 820 millimeters with the extender on it, shooting at f5.6. And so.
Yeah, we call that a sissy camera.
That's right. But I'll let my pictures do the talking for him. But the other part, my experience is I like moving and working the shot, right? And chasing the bird. I've chased birds all through all sorts of swamps and that kind of stuff. And that goes back to kind of my hunting days. I have that thrill of finding and doing those things, I just hit the shutter instead of pull the trigger. Right? So
And you can move a
mobility-
lot faster and a lot more limber, whatever you call it, without a tripod and without a 30-pound camera on your shoulder like I'm always carrying. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, again, the sensor technologies and so forth, like this one's pretty close to ISO invariant. So I can shoot pretty dang dark and lighten it all up in Lightroom and not get too much noise. The Canon, I understand is new Canon, the one you've got is probably totally ISO invariant. And those are little subtleties that have changed so much over the introduction of ISO. And again, a lot of this is coming from the work that you guys are doing in astrophotography about this camera has a heat sink in it.
Right. Because the cooler the chip, the better.
Right. And it
We
gets
cool
really,
our chips down to minus 30 degrees Celsius in astronomy sometimes.
I'm a Florida boy. I can't do that with my camera, but particularly when you're shooting long videos or you're doing real long exposures, right? We don't have all the, it gets hot and you get those pixels firing off. So the heat sinks make a huge difference.
Right. And we take something called a dark frame in astronomy where, we take a dark frame at the same temperature that we're taking the actual exposures and then subtract that noise from the image also.
But
And,
the point being, a lot of the things that you guys have pushed the envelope for is kind of trickling down into the enthusiast cameras, right? And the normal still cameras. Part of that, is because the market, if you want to go out and just shoot good general purpose photos.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So the manufacturers have got to come up with a lot of good ways to make the enthusiast experience.
Yeah, it's come up with some reason to make it $5,000 more worth to get a 1DX Mark III.
Yeah, but the point of that, a couple of our friends that talk about, they just do the truisms like always shoot, f11 or shoot, some of the stuff that you say about you don't want to raise your ISO because that's going to put too much noise.
It's understanding all the different features and how they cooperate with each other is the way to get the best shot. So, and we know the people that always go around saying, well, you got to do this, you got to do that. And it's usually people that don't have enough experience to know that there's 10 different ways to do exactly what they're doing.
Or there's, with the new technologies, there's no reason to do it at all, right? That's the thing that people are missing, right?
Right. With all the stuff that applies to JPEG only and not to RAW. Yeah.
Right.
You mentioned shooting the f11. I just noticed that Canon, along with the R5, they have an 800 millimeter f11 lens, constant aperture, that they're kind of pushing.
Bye, Alexander. Sorry, we went on a long time. We're nerds.
You were so kind to even sit through all of this. Thank you.
Thank you. So, yeah, they do offer an f11 600 millimeter also that they're the only one. They don't have an f4 for the mirrorless yet, 600 millimeter, but they do have adapters. Supposedly it's just as good with the adapter, but
Yeah.
Well, and part of that's they're trying to catch up on the size issue, right?
Right. Well, the new 600 millimeter lens that I ordered is actually almost 3 pounds lighter than the one I had, but it's back ordered until February. So once I get an actual lens to attach to one of these bodies, I'll have a lot more information for you. For now, they just look pretty.
But buddy, what they're doing, right? And I think this is really clever. They got the smaller mirrorless bodies to our bodies, and a lot of megapixels on them, so you can crop more. But more importantly, that sensor is totally ISO variant. So even though you're shooting with an f11 lens, you can take a pretty dark photo and bring it back through post-processing and lighten it up to a pretty reasonable.
Like I loaned Adam Betchel my camera, and he went to Central America on a trip with it, and he came back and he knew nothing about cameras, so I set it on a certain setting for him to use, and he came back and every one of the exposures was totally black, the raw file, but I was able to bring up 90% of them to usable photographs because he had gotten the data in there, but it just wasn't visible. So yeah, so that's great information. And I think we'll probably end it here unless you guys want to do some more chatting.
I'm good. I'm going to go get a beer.
I have to. I'm going to make dinner for the wife because she gets hangry about this time, and it's a good idea to throw food at her right about now. So thank you so much, Steve, for bequeathing some of your knowledge upon us. And I'm going to use some of that, and then I'm going to act like I made it up myself, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, about it.
Yeah, and then tell everybody else and take credit for it, because that's just the way I run things here at Sunlit Earth. But I hope to see you guys soon out at Clyde Shepherd Nature Preserve. And buddy, as always, thank you for spending your time with us today.
Yeah, thanks, buddy.
And anyone watching, stand by for the recorded version on the Sunlit Earth page and come join our Facebook group at Sunlit Earth. And adios for this week on This Week in Birding and Nature Photography. Bye, everybody.